Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. We're really pleased to see so many of you with us today. My name is Michelle Maloney. I'm the co-founder and national convener of the Australian Earth Laws Alliance, or AILA, as we like to call ourselves. It's with great pleasure today that we have wonderful human beings, John Seed and Skye MANDOZAY, joining us to talk about deep ecology and connectedness. But before I introduce them, I'd like to acknowledge country. I'd like to acknowledge that I live, work and play on the beautiful lands of the Cubby Cubby peoples up here just north of Brisbane. I'd like to acknowledge the first peoples across the continent. Land was never ceded in treaty or in any other way, and it always was and always will be Aboriginal land. Within the work we do inside AILA and our other sister organisations like Future Dreaming and the New Economy Network Australia, acknowledgement of country is much more than just words. It's a genuine expression of respect for the remarkable civilizational culture of the first peoples of this continent, which have been here and grew up a remarkable governance system that we are in deep admiration of. The work we do with our elders and friends, Mary Graham, Ross Williams and Paulina and many others, has shown us some amazing ways of organising human beings to live in relationship with non-humans or nature, or however you express that rest of the planet that we love so much. So yes, would like to acknowledge all First Peoples who might be on this call today. And we always invite folks in the wonderful world of Zoom to please feel free to write in the chat whose country you're on, and perhaps any plants or animals you've seen today that have made you happy. I can certainly start that by saying in my garden this morning, there were at least 5 blue-banded bees buzzing about and making me very, very happy and making the planet a better place. So what's AILA all about? The Australian Earth Laws Alliance, we're a small not-for-profit organisation profoundly and excitedly interested in how human beings interact with the living world, and our particular objective of our work is to help increase knowledge and understanding about building Earth-centred societies. And we're governance nerds, so we have a particular interest in how we shift law, economics, political structures and community organising to be ecocentric. So the structural reform, but built from our own personal relationship and love of the living world is what we're interested in. And it's part of that we're delighted, and I'll just get myself out of the way to show you the logos. We're really thrilled to be working with UTS, Transdisciplinary School, a number of wonderful human beings in this new webinar series. So it seemed really terrific to kick off our Kinship, Exploring Human Nature Connections, with someone who I'm a great admirer of and a new friend, Skye. So John Seed and Skye, welcome to our Kinship, Exploring Human Nature Connections webinar series. How are you today?
Great, thank you. Great admirer of yours, and in awe of all the stuff that you're doing.
Oh, thank you, John. The awe is definitely mutual. I hope that everyone listening today who might be in the parts of the world where John, myself and others are from coped okay with Cyclone Alfred too. We want to pay respects to anyone who's struggling a little. It was a very, very scary time for many of us. So, yeah. And Skye, you're down in Melbourne, is that right?
That's right.
Today?
Wurundjeri country, just along the Birrarung River, right on the edge of the Warrandyte National Park. Yeah.
Oh, beautiful, beautiful.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, wonderful. All right. So what we're going to do today is, as I said, this is the first discussion in what we hope will be every month or two, we're going to have just amazing people who are working in relationship with the living world in lots of different ways, from acoustic ecologists to Indigenous elders to people on the ground caring for country to folks working and writing about multi-species justice and other things like that. So what we're going to do today is invite John and Skye to have a yarn, which will be wonderful for 30 or 40 minutes, and then we'll open up to questions. And if you have any questions throughout, please do write them in the chat, and my colleague Sarah and I will curate them and run them through for us. So we're together for about an hour and a half, and I'm really just looking forward to hearing John and Skye talk about deep ecology and what it's all about, where it comes from, its ideas, and something that I always love hearing about are the practices people use to help us connect with nature and the living world. So enough from me, and over to you both. Thanks so much, John and Skye.
Thank you, Michelle. So I'm going to start off talking about the origins of deep ecology, and then we'll go on to both have a yarn about how deep ecology helps us to connect. So deep ecology is a philosophy of nature the term was coined by the late Arne Næss, who was the professor of philosophy at Oslo University. And according to Næss, underlying all of the symptoms of the environmental crisis is the illusion of separation between human beings and the rest of the natural world. And this illusion of separation, he said, was a result of anthropocentrism or human-centeredness, the idea that human beings are the center of everything. So to the anthropocentric perspective, human beings are the crown of creation, and basically the world is a pyramid with humans on the top. Everything is just there to support us. Only humans have intrinsic value. The rest of the world may have instrumental value if it's a resource for us. And Næss said that this pernicious fallacy goes back so far in our history, at least back as far as the Old Testament, that we're not going to be able to think our way out of the mess that's been created. He said that ecological ideas won't save us. What we need is ecological identity or ecological self. And that in order to nourish this ecological identity, he called for community therapies to heal that illusion of separation and to allow us to experience our deep rootedness in the natural world. Starting in 1986, when I met my next teacher after Arne Næss was Joanna Macy, the American Buddhist philosopher activist, and she and I began to work together and have since been joined by many others to try to create the community therapies that Arne Næss called for. And this we called experiential deep ecology, or now it's often called the work that reconnects. And the spiral of the work that reconnects starts from gratitude. And here I'll hand over to Skye.
Beautiful intro, John. Thank you. Yeah, so the spiral of the work that reconnects is, it's the map that we follow into this ecological identity. So from this place that a lot of people experience as being separate or outside of nature, and these steps help to kind of dismantle that bit by bit until ideally we're experiencing ourselves as nature. And so the first step is gratitude. And gratitude, in this sense, it's not gratitude as a synonym for positive thinking, which is kind of was my first experience or like resistance to this idea of gratitude. It's a much deeper rooted gratitude than that. This is the recognition that, we are wired, many of us, with a negativity bias, which is essential survival strategy, and that we need to consciously choose to focus on what's also happening alongside the trouble that we naturally notice and tend to prioritize in our awareness. And so bringing forward what's often in the background, which is just this incredible complex amount of conditions that allow even the next breath of air to happen. And when we start to focus on these conditions, then what happens naturally is this experience of life as gift, and this incredible overwhelming sense of being part of something incredibly mysterious and magical and beyond our comprehension. And this kind of creates a really strong foundation to which we then step into the next part of the work, which is honoring our pain. But what I'll also just say about gratitude, something that Joanna Macy often said, is that in this sense of understanding gratitude, it's also politically subversive, because our culture, the industrial growth revolution, is so dependent on consumerism and increasing amounts of that, and very much feeds back to us the story of not enoughness, impoverishment, like needing more. And gratitude directly counteracts that. So from that perspective, she saw it as a very politically subversive practice. And some of the things that we do to support or open into gratitude is gratitude open sentences, which are really, it's such a simple practice, but Joanna always said it was one of her favorite practices. And it's basically a sentence with a kind of ... at the end that you then fill in. So for example, something I love about being alive on Earth is, and that's one we often begin our gatherings with. John always begins his gatherings with that one. And there's many more to that. And it's such a beautiful thing to start to turn our attention to that. Yeah, in the workshops that my partner and I run, we also create like an offering altar at the beginning where we intentionally offer back foods, or we pour libations onto the earth, and we offer directly back to Gaia at the beginning of our workshops as part of this feeding of the inner generosity and starting to create that reciprocal foundation to then take off into. And there's other things we do, but those are, I would say, the two foundational pieces. And then John can introduce the next one. Oh, you're
John,
muted.
sorry, you're on mute. It happens.
Thank you. The next piece, Joanna now calls Honouring Our Pain for the World. But when I met her in 1986, she came to Australia. She was offering a workshop that she then called Despair and Empowerment. And what I learned from Joanna was that we live in a culture of denial, where there's a profound denial of a huge swathe of our humanity, and that we are never invited to feel, let alone share, our deepest feelings of anguish and rage and terror about what we see happening to our world. And we're taught to fear these feelings, that right from when we're children, it's clear that these feelings are never welcome in polite company. And so what Joanna said is that one of the consequences of this is that these feelings are a really important part of our intelligence. That one thing that we can know for certain is that over 4,000 million years, every single one of our ancestors since the first cell has been intelligent enough to reach the age of reproducing itself before it was consumed, without exception. And meanwhile, in every generation around us, thousands were falling by the wayside and not leaving their genes in the gene pool, but our ancestors were never among these. And until very, very recently, cognition had nothing to do with this. For 99.9999999% of the time, this intelligence was feelings. We can call it instinct, we can call it intuition, but what we call feelings is what remains in us of this ancient intelligence which stood the test of time and which allowed our ancestors to make good choices, when to run towards, when to run away, when to fight, when to flee, what was safe, what was dangerous. And this intelligence was honed in every generation, that any mistake meant that your genes didn't enter the gene pool. And so these feelings appear with the whole force of natural selection behind them. And in order to suppress them, even though we're unconscious of this, an equal and opposite amount of energy is needed. And so a huge part of our life force is squandered in suppressing this emotional intelligence. And I'm not dismissing cognition. Cognition is a very beautiful addition to the suite of our abilities, but by itself, cognition is sterile. That I used to think as an environmentalist that my job was to raise awareness, that once everyone was aware, everything would be okay. Wrong. Everyone is aware, nothing is okay. And that's because without the force of the passions behind it, the cognition is helpless. We just feel paralyzed. We feel helpless. We feel hopeless. What can one person do anyway? And so when we do the ceremony of honoring our pain for the world, it changes everything. A bit more from you, Skye?
Yeah, thanks, John. I agree, it changes everything. And it did for me. I definitely experienced that in encountering the the truth mandala, which is one of the core practices that we do in this part of the spiral, where folks are invited into this powerful ritual, and they are in the safety of ritual space that has a beginning and an end, and they're in the safety of having what we call a collective nervous system. So the idea being that it's actually really challenging to hold collective pains on your own as a so-called individual, but to be together with others, to enter into this collective nervous system, and to have our experiences normalized and held in lovingly and compassionately, enables more space and courage for these experiences to move through in a good way. And then to have that ritually ended, and often in the ones that my partner and I run, we offer the water or the tears back to the earth as part of this gratitude, and there's just something very powerful about that gesture of offering back at the end of a ritual that connects the tears and the grief that we felt to this larger being, and gives it I guess a bit of a purpose. But in addition to that, there's a way that I've experienced, and I know Joanna's spoken about this, no doubt John, that there's a way that we shut ourselves down from this larger belonging to this wider being, when we don't have the space, or we don't have the ability to get in contact with this grief, to this despair, this pain. And there's a bit of a skill in grieving. And my teacher, Francis Weller, who's someone who I studied with and whose work I weave into this aspect of the spiral, something that he says is that the river of grief is endless, and which is often what the people coming to this work, what they fear. It's like, once I open that door, it'll never shut, because it feels like the river of grief is endless. And he says, yes, the river of grief is endless. It's true. But there's a skill, which is the entering into the river of grief, and they're coming back out again, and letting ourselves be renewed by the water of grief in company, and then coming back out again. And so for me, that was just such a beautiful contextualization of what we do together. And some of the things that we do in addition to this grief ritual that John introduced, the truth mandala, which is also the core ritual that I believe Joanna Macy offers in her version of the work that reconnects, is Francis Weller's 5 gates of grief, which some people call the 6 gates of grief. And they're just these little gates that he names that support us to bring a bit more clarity to what those griefs are, because sometimes when it's amorphous and they're all intertwined, which is often the case with grief, it can be difficult to let it move. And so he offers these gates, and we do these little practices to help people draw forward the griefs. And I'll just name them, and we won't go into them now, but I'll just name what they are for those who are interested. The first one is, everything I love, I will lose. So it's the truth of impermanence. That's the grief that every single one of us who has life will experience, right? Both personally and in community. The second one is, for the places in me that have not known love. So that's the grief of neglect, whether that's intentional neglect by caregivers, or the neglect that almost all of us suffered, which was our parents didn't know any better, but they did their best. And yet there were parts of us that did not receive what they needed to, in order to grow us fully, and the grief of that. The next one was a really powerful and important gate for me, which is called what I expected but did not receive. And so that's the idea that we are all Paleolithic in our inheritance, both like physiologically and in terms of the kind of cognitive and nervous system expectations of what we thought we would encounter being born here. We all expected to be in village, living in reciprocal relationship with land, experiencing regular ritual, having lifelong relationships from cradle to grave. There's all these ways that we expected to be, because that's how we evolved. And yet our current lifestyles in the industrial growth society are so far removed from that. And there's this like grief that most folks don't even know where it's coming from. And that's often this gate, is this what we expected but did not receive. And hearing those words, it felt like it just, wow, that was just one of the most powerful gates for me in encountering this paradigm. The next one is ancestral grief. So the idea that we can experience the griefs of the ancestors, the unprocessed grief of our ancestors who went through traumas and wars and difficulties. And I believe this very much to be true. It's certainly true in my experience. And then the final one is pain for the world. And so this recognizes that we are interconnected. And even if you aren't reading the news article about a thing, on some level, you're registering it. And these are the more kind of collective griefs. The last one, which is not an official gate, but Francis Willer has named it in some of his more recent talks, is the harms I've done. So that's the kind of guilt-related grief. And so that's a really important one to address in my experience, because I feel like particularly those with colonial settler history, the guilt can keep us locked outside of the experience of being ecologically identified, which is the next step on the spiral. And so that's an essential one for a lot of us to meet that one as well. And so this leads us into the next step of the spiral, which is called the ecological self. It's also known as seeing with new and ancient eyes. And so I'll just name a little bit of what I do and what Joanna Macy does, and then I'll hand it over to John. So Joanna is really in big favor of teaching quite a bit of the framework or languaging in this part of the spiral. So she often will introduce either in detail or just very simply Gaia theory, systems theory, the deep time, and also the teachings on the core insight from Buddhism, mutual co-arising, or what Thich Nhat Hanh called interbeing. And they're all very related, and all of these really feed back into one another, and they're all like languages or frameworks to help us access the same key or core insight, which is everything is connected, we are not separate, and this whole vast body that I look at when I look out my window is my body. They all lead to that same kind of recognition. And so she says that it's really helpful to have a bit of a cognitive or framework to support that shift that happens through the practices that we do in this part of the spiral. Because for many of us, we've been kind of inducted into the absolute opposite belief. And if we don't have a little bit of a something to hold it, and sometimes we struggle to let it integrate. And so I thought that was really profound. And that's something that my partner and I try to carry forward, is introduce these ideas. And then we also introduce animism, which is this idea from earth-based cultures all around the world that this world is full of other than human peoples. So we are surrounded by peoples. They're just not human peoples. And these peoples can be potentially in relationship with us if we relearn how to do that, which so many of us have forgotten. And so those are the kind of ideas. And then we have a whole bunch of practices, which I will hand over to John to share about some of the things we do. Yeah.
So honouring our pain for the world pulls the scales away from our eyes. And so seeing with new eyes follows inevitably and spontaneously, so that we name it, but it's not like it's a very natural transition that takes place. That and the particular processes that we do aren't the essence of it. That I remember quite early on, I said to Joanna that soon after we'd met, that I was having this surprising experience of trying out many different processes at this point in the workshop, and everything seemed to work. And how could that be? And her answer was that when there's some separation between us and the rest of nature, it's all coming from our side. The earth never pushed us away. And the moment that we make a gesture of reconciliation by coming together with a group of people with the shared intention to heal that separation, the earth comes rushing back in. And so she said, it hardly matters what you do after that. The intention does all of the heavy lifting, and many different things will serve as a vehicle. Having said that, the first of the experiential deep ecology workshops that nourish our ecological identity was the one that Joanna and I created in the week that we met, the week that I attended her Despair and Empowerment workshop in Ballina in 1986, we created the Council of All Beings, which I'm doing a workshop in Melbourne on Saturday, and that will be one of the processes that we do still. And so in the Council of All Beings, we learn how to allow a non-human voice to speak through us. And could be a plant or an animal or a feature of the landscape, could be anything at all besides a human being. And you don't have to believe anything in order to do this. You just have to relax and surrender and get playful. But what I can say is that without exception, we are always stunned at what we hear. We always hear voices saying things that we've never heard before, including me, who've done it hundreds and hundreds of times. It's always fresh and creative and astounding. But another process, and perhaps my favorite at the moment, is the one that uses deep time as a way of extending our sense of identity. Arne Naess said that ecological ideas won't save us. What we need is ecological identity or ecological self. And these community therapies, these experiential deep ecology processes, are how we invite our ecological identity to re-emerge. And the particular process that I'll be doing again on Saturday night in Melbourne is called the Cosmic Walk, and it's based on the work of the late Thomas Berry. Thomas was a progressive Catholic theologian at the end of the last century, perhaps the most celebrated such theologian. And quite late in his life, he discovered that he was no longer a theologian, but discovered that he had become a geologian, that his attention turned away from the story that had informed his whole life, the creation myth that started with Adam and Eve and so on. And he recognized that this was just one of 10,000 creation stories that human beings had created, and that humans, one of the things about us is that everywhere we always need to find explanations. We always need to find stories to explain how it is that we are here, what is this place, and where did we come from. And Thomas said that each of these stories is utterly gorgeous and works of art, but the problem is that they tend to be at war with each other, because my story is the true story, and those other thousands of stories are mumbo jumbo, superstitions, heresies, and so on. And so it's not, he said, just that the Christian story is at war with the Muslim story, but that the Catholic story is at war with the Protestant story, and the Shia story is at war with the Sunni story. And he said that it's too late for all that. We can't afford that any longer. We now need a story that will unite humanity rather than separate us. And he proposed that the story revealed by empiricism, the scientific story correctly told, was what his proposal for where we should be looking for this new story. And he said that's because if we aim one of our most powerful telescopes to the beginning, that as we look out into space, we're looking back into time. The light from the sun left the sun 8.5 minutes ago, and so we measure in terms of light years. And when we look back 13 billion light years and we take the light and run it through a prism, we see that back at the beginning, only hydrogen and helium existed, and that the periodic table of elements itself evolved in the course of the evolution of the universe. And he said a Catholic astronomer, a Jewish astronomer, a Buddhist astronomer, they can all agree that if, when we use this as the way of measuring things. And so but he said that we can't leave it to the scientists to tell the story, because they don't know how to turn it into a creation myth. To be a creation myth, it has to be ceremonial, it has to be full of awe and wonder, it has to stun us. And so he called on the musicians and the artists and the mystics to tell the story so as to create it, to turn it into a modern creation myth. Many responded, and one of these was his colleague, Sister Miriam Therese McGillis, who lives in a community in New Jersey called Genesis Farm, and she created the Cosmic Walk, and that's what we use on Saturday nights in the workshops that I facilitate. And in the Cosmic Walk, we build a spiral out of a roll of hemp that's 50 meters long to represent the universe. So each meter of that ball of hemp represents 237 million years of the 13.7 billion year story. And there are 23 beads along this string, and they're appropriately placed so that each of them allows for the telling of some extraordinary story about the evolution of the universe. So the first bead in the center represents the flaring forth of the universe in the first place. And there we tell the extraordinary story about the fact that anything exists at all. Because had the laws of physics even been 1/1,000,000th of a percent different than what they are, nothing would exist. So this extraordinary fact of existence, we celebrate that, and we light a candle in the center, and usually the youngest person in the group will light a taper from that flame from the source and walk around the spiral, lighting one candle after another, and as we tell the story of the emerging universe. And when we get towards the end, where less than a meter from the end of the of this a piece of string, and it's still just dinosaurs, and we just realized that the human story, what we've called history, no candle could possibly be small enough to accurately depict that story on this timeline. And so there's a tremendous kind of humility that emerges spontaneously as we recognize who we are underneath that social identity, who we are underneath the stories that we tell, and a tremendous sense of relief and a sense of coming home that emerges from this. While we're doing this, there's a song that we sing together, a chant. I am as old as the universe. I've been here before and I'll be here again. I am a child of the universe, part of all women and part of all men. And Thomas says that what this process does is it shows us not just that this is the kind of universe within which we live. It's not just like the background, but rather that we are that universe, that every atom in our body came through that story that we've just told. And every cell in my body is descended in an unbroken chain that's 4,000 million years old, and that the human is that point where the universe has developed a certain kind of consciousness, where the universe itself can suddenly start to turn around and become aware of the trail that it has trod for 13.7 billion years to get here. And it's the jaw of the universe that drops in awe and wonder to recognize the glory of this tale. So back over to you, Skye.
Oh, yes, I can attest to the power and potency of the deep time practices. The first time I experienced them, I felt that very kind of wobbly, paradigmatic shift experience happening in my whole being. And yeah, incredibly potent, especially after having shared a grief ritual together. And then, as John said, after all of that, then we go into this profound council of all beings practice where we shared our human faces. And yeah, so grateful to these different practices for supporting that. Something my partner and I also sometimes do at this part of the spiral is that we will do a deep time meditation or a meditation on the animacy of Gaia as taught by Stephen Harding in Animate Earth and Gaia theory. And we will then go straight from that into a breathwork ritual, which supports a little bit of a altered state, but in a gentle way that also helps people really kind of tap into the feeling of all of this incredible insight they've received through these practices. And then from there, we go into the fourth step of the spiral, which is called going forth. And this is really a beautiful part where we're supported to start to understand how in identifying with our larger Gaian selves, with the ecological self, it frees us in a way from this very linear idea of what action looks like, of what participation looks like, which can be very prescriptive, can be very narrow in our current culture, and can lead to people not wanting to participate and therefore into apathy or kind of performative or inauthentic permission that doesn't have staying power, that often leads to burnout quite quickly. And instead, Joanna taught about the different ways of participating. So, showing how holding actions and frontline activism feeds into what Ayla's doing with the kind of earth laws, is the transforming systems work. So looking at the different legal systems and road systems and education systems and healthcare systems, it's transforming systems. And then the third dimension of activism is this shift in worldview, this shift in sense of self, and how all three of these different dimensions are essential. None is more important than the other, and they all kind of feed into each other and support one another. And there's just such a beautiful widening that happens when we kind of given this framework. And then in addition to that, this idea that if we can really kind of get in contact with this larger sense of self through the practices we just described, then there's this possibility to start to participate more consciously in what Joanna called the emergent intelligence of Gaia, this kind of non-linear, complex responsiveness from Earth that might not lead, which may cause you to participate in ways that you don't really understand fully, or you don't get to see the full fruit of your actions, which she says a lot of those of us who want to participate are confined by this, I need to do that and see this outcome. And if I don't, then it means I'm not a good activist, or I'm not doing a good job, or whatever. And she said, no, the Earth is just, it's like a giant trickster. It doesn't adhere to such linearities. And there's this total freedom with coming to understand this emergent intelligence, in the sense that it frees you up to follow what she would call the kind of ecological niche, or what Stephen Harrod-Buhner calls the golden thread. It's like this deeper pull along a course of participation that is beyond the mind, and might not result in some hero narrative for you, or some like very shiny offering at the end or even something you might get recognized or paid for. And yet if you're following that, then that is the payoff, is just feeling yourself in contact with soul, in responsiveness to the larger system you're participating within. And so it's really beautiful. And also part of that is her strong teachings around uncertainty, and the need for us to really become friends with this large uncertainty that we're in relationship with in this moment. And the way that by wanting to know that this, that what I'm doing is good, or that the way that the trajectory of the human race is going is bad, or like there's all these ways that we kind of put definitions on things and want to know things for sure. And she said that really limits the way that we can come up with these kind of creative third responses that don't adhere to the binaries that so many of us are offered. And so there's this beautiful opening that happens here in this part. And yeah, I'll hand over to John to have any final words and practices that we do here.
Oh no, I think that will do for the practices. But I'm just remembering that the title of this event was Kinship, and then the subtitle was How Deep Ecology Helps Us to Connect. And so the practices that we've been speaking about help us to connect with the more than human world in a way that's synchronous, I believe, with what all Indigenous societies practice, that every Indigenous society that has held on to its ritual and ceremonial life regularly, many times in the course of a year, people will drop the habitual day-to-day social activities and gather together to honour all our relations, to honour the more than human world, to remember our role in the bigger picture. And I believe that must be because it's correcting for a tendency which is, I used to think it was just like modern humans that would stray away from a recognition of who we really are. But if so, why is it that even hunter-gatherer societies who live their entire lives totally embedded in the natural world still stop their hunting and gathering and get together in ceremony to remember these kind of things together? And so that's why I think these processes are often on towards the end of the workshop, in the last sharing circle, people report a sense of relief and a sense of coming home to something that is utterly familiar. And and I think that that's because we've been doing this for, I don't know, 250,000 years, and it's only very, very recently that certain cultures have suppressed these things. I mean, if Starhawk is correct, 9 million European women were burned at the stake in order to suppress these kind of practices. And of course, we're all suffering from the trauma of that. And of course, it's kind of scary to see these things re-emerging, but I feel that they're re-emerging with more and more strength. And one of the remarkable things is that although all of the practices that we do in the workshops are directed towards ecology, that perhaps the biggest surprising outcome is the extraordinary sense of love that the participants are feeling for each other. And every time someone will share that, I've only known you people for less than 36 hours, and I already feel closer to you than anybody that I've ever known, including my own family. How can this be? And it just seems that when we stop and we share these kind of things with each other, it allows for a tremendous wave of connection between the humans as well.
Wonderful. That's actually a really great, oops, I think I've taken away your spotlight. I did not mean to do that. I want to bring you back into the spotlight. Sorry. There we go. Thank you so much, John and Skye. I'm sure everyone will agree that that was a really wonderful and very efficient overview of the kind of the spiral, the work that reconnects, that pattern of going through gratitude and honoring pain, the grief, ecological self, and then going forth into the world. So thank you. I really appreciate that overview. I've got a couple of questions, and if folks have questions or comments, there's a few in the chat, but I'll come back to them in a moment. But please do pop in any chats or any requests for further references. I might start with the sort of the personal stories you have seen or shared with others about the connection and disconnection, if we could. And then maybe later I have some questions about how people respond to this work and what they go on and do with this work themselves, because I'm very curious. A lot of the work that we're interested in inside the Australian Earth Laws resonates very much with what you were talking about, John, this perception, this understanding that sort of modern industrialism has in fact taken human beings and caused this separation. And then the history of which cultural group or which structure started that process is a whole nother conversation. But can you talk a little bit about, either one of you, John or Skye, the actual how people explain their feelings of disconnectedness once they've worked that through or talked about it? To what extent are people even aware of it, or is it something that comes out after this little hunger to reconnect has brought them into a space where they can articulate that? And you're both on mute.
I can go. Yeah, for me, it's this deep meaninglessness is one of the biggest ones that I experience, both personally and in others. The sense, my partner and I describe it as the tinny meaninglessness. So this idea that we're in this, world of meaningless objects, we're separate from all of it. Nothing has inherent meaning beyond what the human mind projects out onto the so-called things. It's very lonely. And so I think that's also one of the feelings, is this kind of existential loneliness, the feeling that there isn't like a kind of like deadness, so when I'm feeling connected, there's a kind of halo of aliveness on everything. right? Even if things aren't going well for me, even if I'm having a hard time in the story or narrative of my life in that moment, the aliveness doesn't go away. There's a very distinct difference between the difficulty arising from challenges versus this existential disconnection. I think a lot of people who don't understand that or haven't recognized it will call it depression, or it often comes out as a kind of nihilism. I think those are some of the ways that it manifests, and yeah, the experience of seeing through that, for me, initially often is accompanied by a sense of like awe and joy and a reignition of wonder and excitement about life, and then just this, I guess, potential and depth, because when you're living in a meaningless existence, then you only have the surfaces to orient towards, whereas once you're re-inhabiting a world of meaning, there's a sense of depth that you can then enter into in life again, right? Which I think in psychology is often attributed to our own psyches. And there's this wonderful experience that happens when you realize that that is available in every relationship in the so-called outside of self experience. So those are some of the words I would use to describe that.
That's wonderful. No, thank you, Skye. John, and obviously we won't dwell on the disconnected stuff. We'll talk about the processes and how they help people. But I think for a lot of folks, it's the last thing a fish will notice is water. And sometimes the last thing that folks in what I call the sort of Western or modern industrial society is the feelings that we have that don't have to be there. So, John, do you have any comments on what people have told you, why they've come to your workshops, or what it is they're looking for, what the disconnect actually is for them?
I mean, not exactly, but what I'm thinking is that I've long had the mission to try to move deep ecology into the mainstream, because to me it seems that this illusion of separation is one of the primary engines that's driving the sixth mass extinction and driving the destruction of the Cenozoic era, driving the destruction of our time. And so one of the ways that I've been doing that is like this, webinars and especially podcasts. And all of my recent workshops, in the opening circle, there's always been at least one person that says something like, I was listening to the radio. It was an American program, but suddenly I heard an Australian accent, and it was this person talking about something, deep ecology, and I realized that he was talking about something that I had always known to be true, but I didn't know there was a word for it, And so that's the thing that I've been noticing that people are bringing is just that, and it was the same for me, that when I first came upon deep ecology, when I read a paper by Robert Aitken Roshi, the Zen teacher, called Gandhi, Dogen, and Deep Ecology, I dropped everything. Everything changed at that moment. And so it feels as though we're waiting to find out about this or something like that.
And perhaps that comes back to your comment, John, the rituals, the processes we engage in together to reconnect with nature actually then bring us closer to each other. So as we come across other human beings writing and talking about this stuff, it does spur our excitement and our interest. So thank you so much. I'm wondering if you can talk a little, and I don't want to dwell on the negative stuff actually, but I love the process that's used in the work that reconnects. And I loved that you were talking about people saying that when you open up grief, that it has no end. And how do people feel about those processes? I know myself, I care so much about the living world and all of life, and get so sad about some things. In the processes that you use, you were talking about it as a river where people can learn how to jump in and jump out again. Are you able to talk about the grief aspect of this work a little more, like why so many people feel grief? That might seem obvious, but sharing that is important. And then I'd actually love, particularly from you, John, to know how have people's stories of grief changed over the last few decades? Because I know the last 10 years, climate change has become much more real to folks who didn't know about it before that. So yeah, two elements of that question: the grief, how you handle those processes, and how people can come back from the depth of their feeling, and then yeah, these trends of more extreme eco-anxiety. Would either of you like to speak to that?
Well, perhaps I'll begin. And what I'd like to say first is that the purpose of these feelings is not to debilitate us. The purpose of these feelings is to wake us up and motivate us and point us in the direction that we need to be paying attention. And that when we do that, and it's interesting that one of the pieces of the truth mandala, the ceremony that we use for this, is that after the person has shared in the center of the circle and sits down, everyone chants, "We hear you," because the purpose of the feelings is not just to awaken you, the person who's feeling them, but to awaken your people. That the purpose of these feelings is to alert all of us to the danger. And once it's clear to the feelings that this has taken place, they've served their purpose and they're happy to get out of the way and allow us to act. And what I've found since doing this work is that because I get to ceremonially sit in grief and anguish and rage and terror at least once every month on a Saturday morning with a group of people for at least an hour and a half, my feelings the rest of the time are pretty well satisfied. Like they are aware of the fact that I'm paying attention to all of these things, and they don't need to wake me up at 3 a.m. any longer, you know. So I just think that's important to know, that although the river of grief is endless, that doesn't mean that you're sentenced to spend your life in there or anything like that. Skye?
Yeah, I mean, on the flip side, I feel like it's actually entering in and allowing ourselves to fully experience that support, and then coming out of that it supports us to feel the depth of the joy, the wonder, and the connection. And that's really important part of the ritual, is that part, which is like the going in, it's the opening up, it's the being supported, it's the being witnessed, it's being brave, because there is, for so many of us, that fear of it'll never end. And then, as John said, it does, especially because there's a kind of ritual demarcation, right? I think when you're doing it on your own, it can be harder to define the the container, you know, and so that kind of contained grief. And if you look in cultures all around the world, I mean, I studied with Francis Wheeler, and he talks a lot about his teacher, who is from a West African community, and they have these multi-day grief rituals when someone passes or if something happens, and everyone participates in it, and there's this deep lament out loud. It's very, you know, it's not polite grief. We're talking about like publicly falling apart together, but then that's almost always followed by music and dancing, and like, you know, there's a real ecstatic element in ways to the kind of ritual grief processes. And I had the great privilege of listening to a woman from Ireland who's currently writing a book after like decades of research on the old lament practices of Ireland, and talking about, you know, the multi-day lament practices that were so part of, you know, many people who are of Western culture that's been lost. So in a way, it's kind of a retrieval of a way, like an ancient technology of meeting grief, which is inherent in every life. But, you know, there's no question that we are living in what my teacher Francis calls the long dark. And he said skill in grieving in this moment is essential. And it is a skill, and learning the ways in which we kind of enter and come out safely. And part of that is the music and the witnessing and the collective nervous system and the ritual practices is all very much a part of that. And it's important. It's important to name the coming out part, because yeah, you don't want to stay there. And that is a day. There are people who get stuck in their grief. And this is not that. This is very much not that. Yeah.
Thank you. I think it's so terrific to hear you talk about this and to be able to share it with, we've still got 100 people on this call live, and I know there's many hundreds who actually signed up, because I find in the work I do that many of the people in the environmental or social justice movement are completely overwhelmed by grief, completely overwhelmed. And I speak for myself. And then there's this fear of going into what you've described in metaphor as a river. There's this fear of opening that thing up, because will it ever close and will I survive it? So it's incredibly encouraging not only to hear you talk about the processes you use, but to be reminded that throughout time and throughout other cultures today, people in different groups have worked out how to share this stuff. And I can only speak for myself as a non-Indigenous person who's grown up in Western framing of life, that I'm often horrified by the inability of our culture to share emotion. One of the most excruciating moments of my life was being at a friend's funeral, and everyone was trying not to cry. And I'd seen on TV other cultures where people wail and moan and collapse, and then they get up again, as you say. And I just think it's something that's really important to me personally, and to make sure our society is so told so often that emotion is the bad stuff and reason and rational thinking is the good stuff, when in fact it all lives together very importantly in the human. But yeah, I really recommend to anyone listening to this chat that if you're interested in these processes, please do connect with, and we'll put more links in at the end, either through locals that or get in touch with John and Skye and others who run these processes, because I can speak from my own personal, feelings of grief, that if you don't let them out, they can take control. So yeah, really powerful stuff. Thank you. So let's move to the more positive stuff now. I always love hearing John and others in the deep, and Skye and others in the deep ecology movement talking about embracing gratitude and the mystery. Again, we live in a world that's been so overly influenced by the rational and the scientific, which I love. Please don't get me wrong, but when any kind of knowledge system moves too far extreme in one direction or the other, I think something is suffering. So when you talk about the mystery, how do people respond in the discussions or the exercises that you do to that? And I loved, Skye, the way you described earlier, this once you engage with the enlivenment, the life that's out there, that it stops being a collection of objects and it becomes this deep, deep place of experience and magic, could you both perhaps comment on the processes you've watched, how people can feel that depth, or what they've described to you as happening to them, or the things that have worked for you?
Nothing's coming to me immediately. Do you want to say something, Skye?
Sure. So just to clarify, the question was about gratitude and how parent folks experience that.
Yeah, how do they share that with you? Or I mean, is it just talking about things they love, or does it change over the course of a session together, or do people become more aware of it?
Definitely. For me, I think the starting place is similar to what you were naming before about the water that we're swimming in, and really just bringing attention to the ways that we are living in a culture that really makes it more difficult for us to come in contact with the mystery and the incredible conditions that are supporting life. It's very rare that I recognize people stopping to notice that, right? And so this idea of noticing, savoring, and giving thanks is the kind of personal practice that we teach with our online deep ecology workshops. And also we send folks out and we give them that little formula, if you will, and just invite them to just take stock of their world, and just whatever they're noticing, spend some time savoring that and then offering thanks. And that's just like such a basic practice that on its own is enough to transform. It's part of my partner and I. It's like part of our weekly ritual practice is coming together and taking stock, not only of our lives, but also of our partnership and like all the things that we do, and just the way that it completely changes the field. And it's powerful. And if you look at earth-based cultures around the world, so many of them begin with that. Like in the Iroquois nation, it's the words before else. In the Khoisan Bushman culture, which is from the land that I grew up in South Africa, starting with gratitude. Anytime you move away from your group and then come back in again, there's some words of thanksgiving that are shared. You know, it's so woven in a way that what's so woven in industrial growth cultures is you know, taking for granted and always wanting more. It's like we've got this more, this emptiness inside, and this is one of the ways that you attend to that emptiness is by noticing. So yeah, I just find it one of the most important steps of the spiral, which I feel is often jumped over because it's important, it isn't recognized, you know. Yeah, I don't know if that makes sense, but yeah,
No, it does. And I'm asking these questions because I'm really inviting you both to elaborate on the processes you've just talked about for folks who might be new to what's involved with all this deep ecology stuff. So that's great. And I think you're right. I mean, and you know, in modern Western psychology, they've proven that even supporting cognitive behavior therapy and other ways through positive mantras, and we call them positive affirmations, but that kind of triggering gratitude in one's brain actually triggers positive happiness in your brain, even separate from appreciating nature. So no, thank you for talking about
I'll
that.
just add, because Joanna
Yep.
says in her book Active Hope that if they were to patent the effect of gratitude, it would be as effective as some of the antidepressants that are out on the market, which is just, I mean, when I read that really blew my mind. I just want to say one other practice, which is also practiced all around the world, and my community that I'm a part of, we just started doing this like about a month ago, actually. We gathered once a week and we do this, is offering practice. And so that's not sharing gratitudes of our own personal lives, human to human, but it's actually turning that gratitude out towards what you called mystery before. And it's about feeding the mystery actual food. And we pour like liquids, and we offer smoke. So that's kind of, I guess, you know, recreating more traditional practice of offering. But that is also, it is like across the board, you will find offering practice at the beginning of almost any ritual space or ceremonial time, and there's a very good reason for that. So yeah, I feel like it helps.
No, that's fantastic.
Yeah.
Thank you. And you know, again, I'm only speaking for myself, I can't speak for others, but growing up in a culture where Christianity took the place of pre-Christian pagan rituals, and Christianity has its own realm of goodness and good things, but it also separated people from nature in a number of ways because it was celebrating a spirituality that was connected to a certain idea of a god and a certain idea of you know, a person who took the form of a god, and so it became very anthropocentric. So even for those who still have some element of Christian faith, and I know this from friends who are in different faith groups, you've still got to work really hard to have those religious beliefs connecting to anything that's like a ritual with earth. So thank you. I've got a couple of questions and comments. Anne has said the non-violent communication list of feelings is invaluable to work with to help identify feelings. So thanks for that, Anne. And non-violent communication is an area or a field of thinking, working, sharing, that if you're interested, you can look that up and you'll probably find great practitioners or people to help you think that through. Howard has said, and I think it links to my question to you a little while ago, an important possible starting point now is for all of us to reflect on when did we first learn about our disconnection from the natural world. And for many, was it an Attenborough documentary or a can of spray to get rid of a pesky insect? And then he says, you know, do you have suggestions on how we should start connecting with ecosystems from our earliest days? And I know we've touched on that with ritual, but do you have some thoughts on how we as a culture encourage each other beyond a deep ecology workshop to connect with nature?
Well, just spend more time in the bush.
Or in the garden?
Yep.
Skye?
Yeah, I mean, I'm totally in agreement with John on that point. I think that could be one of the most simple, important things to do. I think for me, it's also culture, which is, you know, something that John, I know you've become interested in building, you know, culture that goes beyond the workshops, you know, through your deepening ideas, which John can speak of in a moment. But for me, there's something about the way that our culture and the story of the culture and the associated, you know, often implicit assumptions about what's okay and not okay. And part of that is like being an open joyous relationship with other humans and feeling that larger body and expressing grief, those are all that all falls under the like not okay, like weird agreements that we've culturally made with each other. And so what can happen is in a workshop like Deep Ecology, you're in a container that has put those agreements to the side. What comes rushing in is what we call normative consciousness, animism as normative consciousness, or ecological identity as normative, in the sense that that's what our culture and humans have experienced since time forever until very recently. And it's only as a result of this larger container that is culture, Western culture, and the agreements that a lot of us are not experiencing that on a day-to-day basis. And so I've discovered through the very painful experience of living in an indigenous community in the Peruvian Amazon animist community, just how being in company of people that think differently caused me to think and experience differently. And then how returning here very quickly shut me down, right? And so I've noticed that the culture piece is a massive missing piece. It's like you can have the practices, you can have the workshops, and they're important, like actually essential, I think, for that spark of remembering, but then it's on all of the rest of us to then start finding ways to self-organize differently and build little islands of of sanity that'll hopefully join up and create the large culture at some point. That's my dream. But yeah,
I couldn't agree more.
I've experienced the grief of recognizing that that'll probably be a multi-generational thing. I'm not at this stage expecting to see the full fruit of that intention, and that's what I was saying earlier about the emergent intelligence and like working for something that you might not see the end of, and the joy of that, and having to really like connect with that deeper impulse that allows you to not need to see the outcome, but know that it's coming from something deeper, if that makes sense.
Oh, absolutely. And I couldn't agree more. And the work we do in AILA is trying to make people, not make people, that sounds terrible, invite people into a space where they not only think about their own interconnectedness with the living world, but what does that mean for broader culture, broader governance, and the systems change that many people talk about, which I know you guys know, but sometimes you're in a space talking about systems change and everyone thinks you're talking about technological change, when in fact we're saying, no, it's actually about the world views we have, the beliefs and the values we have, and how that shifts upward into clunky things like law and economics and what's of value, et cetera, et cetera. So, and that culture aspect, again, couldn't agree more. I know a lot of folks work with people across different cultures, and one of the things that struck me when I first read some of the work by Mary Graham, and people who know me or know Ayla, we work with a number of Indigenous elders who look across and share the philosophy of First Peoples. And Mary Graham's work, the very first thing I ever read from her was, two things: the land is the source of the law, and you are not alone. And I remember even just that little moment feeling as a lawyer looking for different ways of thinking about governance, just feeling so grateful for those words that we're not alone and we need to connect. I'm just going through some of our other questions. We're talking about grief and yeah, Claire's made a comment. I believe that Indigenous peoples have multi-day grieving ceremonies when someone passes away. Isn't it called sorry business? I think the English words for some Aboriginal peoples who talk about when they go off for either funerals. Yes, some people do say sorry business, and it's a great respect for work shuts down, everything shuts down, which, is often not the case in Western culture. You've got to beg for a bit of leave to go to a funeral, for crying out loud, and then you're straight back at work. Thank you very much. So longer periods for feeling would be very important. Max has said shifting baseline syndrome, relative intergenerational perception and the loss of knowledge and awareness of the health of our ecosystems. Yeah, so shifting baseline syndrome refers to the fact really that we don't know what we've lost, because we keep looking out across a field and go, oh, isn't it a lovely field? No trees, it's all green, there's lovely cows, when in fact there used to be massive forests, but our baseline for knowledge is what it is today. And perhaps the same, as Max has indicated, for awareness of what we've got and what we're losing. So I don't think I've got other questions just yet. I did have a couple more for you. Oh no, there's another one. Jeff's got a great question. I have spent nearly 3 years building a community garden in darkest suburbia, only to find a deep-seated fear of nature. And I'm not sure if he means as he's tried to entice other people in to work in his garden. How do we help people who have almost no connection to the natural world to take their first steps? Oh, John, you're on. Yeah.
I don't know the answer to that because my own work has been very much about once people are ready to take those steps, how to guide them from that point on. And but my sense is that a lot of the time it feels like preaching to the converted or preaching to the choir. And but I think that that's a very important thing to do because it's really if the choir swells in numbers and the beauty of the choral music, that's the way it's going to spread. And those people that aren't ready to take that first step yet, hopefully one of their friends will, and soon enough it'll be their turn. So, but I'm not sure how. I've never had any success in, convincing anyone who's actually, pointing in a different direction. It's only once people have the wish to move in this direction that I feel that I've got anything to offer.
Skye, did you have anything you want to add?
I would, yeah, just very simply just asking them where they find beauty, where they notice beauty, and letting them just feed what's already alive. That would be my approach to that.
Mm. It's actually a conversation I've had a lot throughout the decades of the work I do, and I can share a few thoughts. Whenever we're with groups who we're trying to invite to think differently about the governance side of stuff, we often start the conversation with, what did you do on the weekend? Where did you go? And nearly everyone in Australia, someone will say the beach, someone will say the park, someone will say the footy, but they enjoyed the sunshine and the beer. And really what you're saying is they've been out, they've been with other people, they've been out in the natural world. I find so few people who need to be connected actually think through that they're already connected. And certainly they play in a park and the kids love the trees, or they play and throw a ball. So, Jeff, I'm sure you're doing all that you can to bring good people into the gardening side of it. There is also a theory that once you put your hands or your bare feet in the soil, there's that chemical reaction and there's a change for the better. So maybe just invite them to, why don't you just come and experiment and put one little plant in the ground? I'm sure you'll enjoy it. That certainly gets people going too, I think. Just a couple of comments. It's always nice to read them as people are responding. As we were talking about how we connect, Anne has said prayer circles are remarkably connecting and are some of the most resilient practices in darkest suburbia, and gardening. And, gardening isn't out in the wilderness and it isn't out in the bush, but it's really important for those who do engage because it shows you how things grow and how things die. What sunshine and different soils and waters mean and what comes to your garden and what doesn't. So as an avid gardener who turns every patch of grass I ever find into plants and flowers for the native bees, then I definitely agree with the gardening. Hang on, got some more here, but my mouse is misbehaving. David has said, I struggle with gratitude as people in a wealthier country. Where is the living simpler lifestyles and recognizing an ecological debt we owe to those in the global south? Well, and the ecological debt we owe to the first peoples here in this country as well. So, yeah, I think struggling with gratitude in wealthy places can be tricky, but I think as both John and Skye have suggested, once you start with gratitude, it can open up, healthy feelings of love and grooviness. The guilt. Perhaps we could talk a bit about the guilt. I mean, it's sort of one of the gates of, sorry, what did you call them, love? Gates? I had it written down.
Gates of grief.
Gates of grief. Could we talk a little bit about guilt? Because I think particularly in what I would call first world or colonial legacy places like Australia, there's a tremendous amount of guilt. There's a lot of guilt. We come across people who are incredibly guilty and don't know what to do with the whole colonial process, let alone what 230 years of colonization has done to the ecology of this continent. Did you want to talk for a moment about how people express it, how they cope with it, or processes you've used?
Okay, well, I'll talk about something slightly different, which is that often people feel tremendously guilty, and they feel that the human being is like a cancer on the earth, and that we're like a disease that's bringing about the death of so many species and so on. And my own feeling is that from a deep ecology perspective, that's just as anthropocentric as thinking that we're the crown of creation and the measure of all being. That if it's true that we are, as Aldo Leopold said, a plain member of the biota, if we are a single cell in the vast body of the living earth, then what we're doing to the earth is something that the earth is doing to itself, because we're not from somewhere else. We aren't from elsewhere. We are part of this. Now, why this should be happening, I don't really know. That, of course, this is not the first mass extinction. There have been 6 mass extinctions, and in each case, the extinction spasm is followed by a burst of creativity, and a whole new order of life springs forth. And so I remember a council of all beings where not 1 but 2 cockroaches were present, and a human stepped in saying, I know that humans aren't supposed to be here, but someone's got to speak for the humans. And we're not bad. We're just like adolescents, And anyway, apologizing for the humans. And the cockroaches were like, no, you've had your chance. Get out of here. It's our turn, And so, that from the human perspective, maybe this is an unalloyed tragedy. But looking at it from deep time, everything dies, and humanity will become extinct, because everything becomes extinct. The only question is when. And if I get to vote, I want another 100 million years. I'm just beginning to enjoy myself. I feel like we've just figured out how to have a good time here. It'd be nuts to throw in the towel for what, an electric toothbrush and a leaf blower or whatever it is. But I feel like the guilt is not helpful, that the guilt assumes that we had a choice, but it's like, well, when you look at, I've been reading a lot of history, and just the incredible record of warfare and cruelty. And, so we're all just stumbling, shell-shocked, all suffering from PTSD. And of course we're behaving badly. How could it be otherwise? But somehow I feel that there's a kind of an innocence about us, that we didn't choose to be like this, We didn't choose to be related to chimps more than to bonobos, We didn't choose to be, and somehow to be more compassionate with ourselves, and to understand that maybe a choice could open up from there. Whereas I feel like the guilt, which assumes that we are the villain of the piece, I just don't think that that's helpful. But maybe Skye's got something to say that's more, related to the question that you asked, Michelle.
Agree with everything you just said, John, and it was a tricky and sticky point that you just mentioned for me when I first encountered it. It's one I've had to wrestle over many years, and I can see how, understanding the guilt as a kind of flip side of the human exceptionalism and the anthropocentrism in some circles could be seen as an attempt to bypass the responsibility or something like that. I've heard that response, and I've spoken that response to that. And yet the more that I do this kind of work, and the more that I look at this deep time perspective, and the more that I work to break down what's in the way of experiencing myself as a Gaian being, the more I feel the truth of what John just shared. And the more I'm seeing the way that guilt and actions springing from guilt can in some ways hold the mechanism of the clock that we're trying to go beyond in place. It's like you know, like it's like on the one side you're a bad person who's like intentionally doing it, and then we flip to the other side as like reactionary good people, moral people activity, but neither of them really go beyond the perspective that we're trying to break down, which is ourselves outside of nature. And the guilt, somehow the guilt feels like it's holding that perspective in place. And it's a very subtle point. And I want to underscore that I understand how tricky it is to wrestle it. And it's necessary to wrestle it, because you don't want to use this as a permission not to participate, and the responsibility. And that's the edge there. But I feel at where I'm at now, what John just spoke to and what I just said feels like one of the most important, like, missing pieces in a lot of this kind of work actually is attending to the guilt. And it's the deep time work, I feel, predominantly, and the actually everything we just spoke to. It's the gratitude, it's the pain work, but also this wider sense of self feels really important to putting guilt in context of the larger human story and everything that John just said. So yeah, I'm just in agreement.
Thank you.
Yeah.
It's also stimulated, we don't have time to go through them, but there's some really interesting comments in the chat too. Some are saying, well, guilt prompts action, guilt prompts ethics. We should be responsible for our actions. And someone else said, well, looking at geologic time is a slightly different time frame to thinking about guilt in the moment. Yeah, I think there's some really interesting discussions. And I should use that as a segue to plug the Australian Earth Laws Alliance is hosting an ethics-oriented conference in, the conference, it's a gathering of awesome humans, 1st to the 3rd of May in Brisbane. And we'll be looking at many of these issues around the role of ethics in helping human beings build cultural constraints for things like guilt, or cultural encouragement for things like obligation and love and care. So very good. What I'd like to do in the last few minutes is actually invite John and Skye to give some plugs, promo, living commercials even, for some of your upcoming work and the best websites for people to find you on, if that's okay. I did share a couple of websites at the very beginning, but John, you mentioned a workshop this weekend in Melbourne. Did you want to talk a bit about that and anything else that's coming up? And if you tell me any websites, I'll put them on the link, because I really think we need to encourage people to connect with you guys and others doing this work. It's really important. So John, advertisement time.
I'll send you the websites and put them on the link, but anyone searching John C. Deep Ecology will find them. This weekend in Melbourne is not a public workshop. It's what Skye referred to before as a deepening, which is a new form where we're trying to create a culture of connection. And it's we do the work that reconnects, the same as in a workshop, but it's only for people who have participated in these workshops in the past, and it's free. So there's no sort of workshop fee for the, we just share the cost of the facility and of the food. But the weekend after that, I've got a workshop in Melbourne that's full, unfortunately. Unfortunately for anyone who wants to do it, but there'll be other ones in May and June. And I'm hoping that anyone who's interested will just get in touch and will become part of the mailing list. Skye?
Yeah, thanks, John. I highly recommend Deep Ecology workshops with John if you can get on one. Life-changing. For me, my website is deepearthdreaming.world. And yeah, my upcoming events are on there. At the moment, I'm running study groups on a book called Plant Intelligence in the Imaginal Realm by Stephen Harrod Buhner, who was also a
Wonderful.
deep ecologist.
Sorry, can you tell me the website again? I'll bring it up while you chat.
Deepearthdreaming.world. And so unfortunately the next one is already sold out. John's going to be on that one, but I'll be releasing another one in September. And then I have some online grief work workshops coming up, which haven't been posted yet, based on the work of Francis Weller and the Gates of Grief. And so that'll be released in the next month or so. So if you want to keep an eye out for that, if you're interested in that, we'll go really deeply into the different gates and talk about all of this beautiful stuff. Yeah.
Fantastic. No, I can't thank you both enough. I think it's really important that we all cross-promote and share each other's work so that people can keep making these connections and can keep learning and gathering new techniques and ways of connecting with the living world. And I'll give a quick plug for the AILA website. Will be updated in the next few weeks. We're going to have more of our Kinship series available for all of you. So that webpage there, you can just find the link on our our homepage, earthlaws.org.au. You'll also find wonderful information about our conference and some of our partner organisations as well. So look, it's been an epic session. An hour and a half is a lot of time. John and Skye, I really can't thank you enough for sharing your time with us, and for everybody who's been able to join us either for their 1 hour lunch break. I saw a lot of people sending us lovely messages saying, I'm so sorry, I've got to go back to work. But we hope that you'll watch the recordings and look up John and look up Skye and look up Ayla. But without keeping you any longer, and so we finish exactly on time, let's show a huge thank you for John and Skye in the usual daggy way on Zoom, either an air clap or press your little buttons. But really do thank you for your time. I know being on Zoom is almost the opposite of being out in the bush and with the plants and the animals, but you've been with me and I'm an animal, and you've been with everyone else who's an animal. So I hope you've had as much fun as I have. Thank you so much, everybody, and we look forward to seeing you all again soon. Get out there and pat the grass and chase the bees, and we'll see you soon. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone. Beautiful.
Thanks, Michelle. Bye.
Thanks, guys. Bye.